Stream, got it.
Now I can start again.
Okay.
Hello everyone, welcome to our 8th lecture for the academic year 2021-2022. And this lecture
Melissa, I can't hear you.
Okay. Hello everyone, and now everybody can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Welcome to our opening lecture for the academic year 2001 and 2022. And this lecture is, more than that, a lecture for launching our new undergraduate program, which is fully in English at Istanbul University Department of Political Science and International Relations of the Faculty of Economics. With our esteemed faculty, today we are here to listen to a presentation which is about changing global order and human rights. My name is Melissa and I am the co-moderator for today. I'm looking forward to learning more about the crucial topic that closely concerns all countries of the world. And the name of our guest who will make a presentation today is Professor Jack Donnelly, and thank you so much for being here, sir. And before starting the presentation, I'd like to briefly introduce you to our audience. Professor Donnelly was born and raised in New York, and in his university webpage, he says he had the good fortune to be a student in Washington, D.C. And during the next
Melissa, sorry, can I interrupt you, Melissa? Can you get a little bit closer to the microphone?
Okay,
maybe
sorry.
It's with my computer.
Or maybe turn your volume up.
Yeah, maybe I do it.
So after completing Professor Donnelly was born and raised in New York, and in his university webpage, he says he had the good fortune to be a student in Washington, D.C. And during the Nixon era of Vietnam protest and Watergate, before heading west to University of California, Berkeley for his PhD. After completing his PhD at Berkeley in 1982, and teaching at University of North Carolina and in some other colleges in the East Coast, he had joined the University of Denver in 1992. And during his time in Denver, Professor Donnelly has been a visiting professor in several universities around the world, including Tulane University, USA, and National University of Singapore, and the University of Connecticut, and Bar Ilan University, Israel, and National University of Costa Rica, and the University of the Republic of Uruguay. And his research areas include areas of research and IR theory, human rights, historical international relations, political theory, and international relations. I now leave the platform to Professor Ahmet Öztürk and our distinguished guest, Professor Donnelly, for his lecture and the very fundamental topic of human rights for all of us.
Thank you, Melissa, for your introduction, introducing my professor from University of Denver. For some years, I would say, but maybe more, I have taken from you, Professor Donnelly, international relations theories and advanced theories. And I knew that you have been working on human rights for about maybe more than 2 decades. And I just read earlier today that your first publication on the topic goes back to 1980s. And needless to say, you have very numerous and influential publications and books on the topic. And besides your expertise and your publications and your authority in the area, human rights is a very, very important topic for all of us. That one of the main arguments on the human rights studies is whether or not human rights is universal or relative topic to us. From your publications, I got some points, some notes in front of me that human rights had been relative in history, but in contemporary world, human rights is a universal topic. But our universe is our world, and world is changing. There are powers rising and declining. Global setting of the power structure or global order is changing continually. And we are now talking about power shift in which, some powers are rising, particularly in the East, for example, China, Russia, and some other regional powers. And Western powers are there, they are not declining, but they are sharing the international system with new powers. In this framework, I'm not going to take your lecture from you, but I just introduce the framework of the your lecture on human rights, that globe is changing and we are going into a multipolar world. In such kind of, under those changes in the global system, where are we heading to in terms of the future of human rights and the development, and also human rights studies as well? I now leave you the platform, and we are listening until the questions we will have from our audience. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Ahmed. Back when I taught him, we both had a lot more hair. But that's the way things go. So what I like to do when I do these things is that I talk for a relatively shorter period of time, leaving plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to plan to talk for about 20 minutes on the general topic. And since you guys are missing your dinner to get this, you should at least get a chance to participate. So what I want to focus on is international action on behalf of human rights. Right? And as Ahmed said, I actually started working on this stuff back in the late 70s. It's been something that I've sort of grown up with, as the topic has kind of grown up with. And I want to reflect on what I see as the fundamental limits of international action. Right? The basic argument I want to suggest is that most of the work of implementing and enforcing human rights takes place at the national and local level, and that international actors are primarily supporting actors, and that there are a relatively small range of things that international actors can do well to make a contribution to the effective implementation of human rights. All right? If we think about the idea of international regimes, the idea of principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures that regulate relations with respect to a topic, clearly there has been a global human rights regime that has emerged over the last 50 or 60 years. We have an extensive body of international human rights law that is widely endorsed by nearly all states, and that provides a normative infrastructure for discussions about human rights. And what I think is most important is to recognize the way in which the existence of the shared set of norms has reshaped the discussion of human rights. When I started working on this back in the 70s, right, we were asking questions like, should human rights be part of foreign policy? Not how should human rights be part of foreign policy? And we were asking questions like, which human rights ought we to emphasize in our foreign policy, rather than how do we advance the full body of internationally recognized human rights? In other words, there was controversy about the very topic of pursuing human rights in foreign policy, and even more problematically in international organizations and regional organizations. And there was not a robust agreement on the substance of internationally recognized human rights. Right? This begins to change around 1976. All right? From an American point of view, This is when Jimmy Carter ran for and was elected president. From an international point of view, this is when the two international human rights covenants, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, entered into force. The following year, Amnesty International wins the Nobel Peace Prize. You have this coming together at the international level with the covenants, at the level of bilateral foreign policy with the United States, explicitly introducing human rights into its foreign policy, and at the transnational NGO level with the recognition of Amnesty International receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, primarily for its work on protection against torture. So that this is still in the heart of the Cold War, but what you have is the beginnings of what becomes a steady stream of change over the next 20 years. All right? Everybody starts talking about human rights. They start talking about them as if they are universal, and they start referring to the body of universal human rights law. Frequently cynically, right? But we begin to think about human rights as an ordinary part of international relations, and we think about human rights as something that are defined by the body of international human rights law. Right? Now, still, you had individual countries, individual groups, individual persons picking and choosing where they were going to be pursuing their human rights objectives. But we began regularly talking about human rights, and we did it within a context of shared norms. All right? Those shared norms then become important both for structuring international discussions, but also in some ways even more important for national activists. Because for the first time, national human rights advocates can argue that they are not pursuing partisan political objectives, that they are not agents of foreign ideas and ideologies, but simply they are asking their own governments to implement the rights that they have voluntarily acknowledged are the rights of all of their citizens through their participation in the body of international human rights law. When you are saying, these are rights that you, my government, has recognized, here's the treaties you've signed. All right? All I'm asking you is to implement these rights that you've recognized. The terms of the discussion change fundamentally. You can still get thrown in jail. You can still get disappeared. You can still have bad things happen to you, but we're carrying on a different kind of conversation in a different political environment. And it takes a couple decades for this to solidify to where human rights advocates are not treated as partisan political hacks. You may not like them. You may still try to harass and in some cases repress them, but they're not just another political party. They are a kind of domestic political actor that is able to draw on transnational, international, and bilateral support, making arguments that are clearly political but not partisan. So what we have developing in the 70s and 80s in particular is the transformation of human rights from a partisan political issue to a fundamentally non-partisan, although still political issue, right? We're talking about how governments act. You can't do human rights in a non-political way because it is about political action, but you can do it, and we built a body of local, national, transnational, and international actors that transformed human rights into a relatively non-partisan global campaign. All right. Now, that body of law, that reshaping of the political space, it seems to me, was and remains the most important international contribution. All right? The Chinese are not thrilled by the body of international human rights law, but they do not denounce it. All right? And surprisingly, occasionally they will actually have good things to say about human rights. All right? This is important in shaping how the politics of human rights develops. It creates spaces that previously were not there, and it constrains repressive regimes in how they go about their repressive actions. All right? And that's important. It helps to provide some degree of protection for some kinds of local activists, particularly in situations that are not really terrible. All right, I think one of the ironies of international human rights action, I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, but it is in a certain sense ironic, is that it has its least impact where it's most needed. When you have massive systematic repression, there is very little that international or even national actors can do. All right? There isn't the space for the kind of fundamentally nonpartisan political action that is central to human rights. On the other hand, where you have countries where things are not too bad, or even pretty good in some areas, you actually have spaces then where, first of all, local actors are able to act. And then international actors can act in support of those local actors. All right? This is where international action has been most effective and can be most effective, right? And it's because of the fundamental logic of human rights. Right? Human rights are universal values, but they are implemented almost entirely nationally in the contemporary world. We have a system of national implementation of internationally recognized human rights. Right? You get the enjoyment of your rights primarily through your own government, the government that you are a national of, or the government where you are residing. Right? The actual politics of human rights on a day-to-day basis is fundamentally national, and in some cases even local. And it has to be that way, because there are far too many human rights issues for global institutions, given how weak they are to do anything. And ultimately, I think one of the things that we've learned is that human rights are safe in the long run only when the people whose rights are at stake are actively and centrally involved in protecting them. If you give people rights, they will lose them quickly. I think this is the evidence of decolonization in Africa, the evidence of the breakup of the Soviet Union. Simply announcing that people have rights does very little good. Well, it's better than announcing that they don't have rights, but in the long run, it doesn't do very much good. Rights are only secure when the people whose rights are immediately at stake are able to act on their behalf. All right? Which as a practical matter means civil society. Human rights are most secure in places where there are robust and active civil society actors. Right? I've often said that if you want to know one thing about the human rights situation in a country, what you should look at is the rules on registering an NGO. The better the human rights performance, the easier it is to register an NGO. The worse the human rights performance, the harder it is to register or operate an NGO. All right? Repressive governments understand this. The politics of human rights takes place primarily in the space of civil society. So what does that mean for international action? What it means for international action is that effective international action has to be focused fundamentally on supporting nonpartisan civil society actors. All right? This is where we can have an impact on the ground. All right? And I rarely have good things to say about American foreign policy, but in the 1990s and 2000s, I think we got it right. Or certainly George Soros got it right. All right? That the important thing is open societies. The important thing is civil society support. The important thing is making sure that the people on the ground who are doing the day-to-day work of human rights are getting the kind of support that they need. So what's happening in Russia today, right? Notice that Russia is getting worse and worse, and as it gets worse and worse, the space for autonomous civil society action is closing down. All right? Now, the other major contribution that international action makes, the amnesty logic of blame and shame. Information exchange. All right? As things get worse, there's actually less that you can do because the people that you need to do it are not capable of doing it on the ground. All right? At that point, you have very little left other than trying to publicize abuses. All right? We blame violators and we attempt to shame them into behaving somewhat less badly. Now, the shame part is problematic. The worst violators are shameless. All right? But blaming is still important. All right? For a number of reasons. At the very least, those who are involved in or would like to become involved in local human rights activism can see that they are not being ignored. There may be extreme limits on what, as a practical matter, the international community can do on their behalf, but knowing that they are not simply being ignored, knowing that others acknowledge and are attempting to draw attention to your suffering is important. It's also important that those who believe in human rights, at the very least, engage in verbal action on their behalf. All right? That if we value these things, there may be severe constraints on what, as a practical matter, we can do in terms of supporting direct human rights action. But at the very least, we can speak out forcefully and consistently against abuses, so that people who are suffering do not get lost. And even where we cannot do very much, or for political reasons we make the decision that we cannot afford to do very much, we do not let the issue disappear. Right? What this means then is that we have a system in which international action fundamentally encourages domestic action, and where international actors can engage in monitoring of practices, publicizing violations, trying to bring attention to problems, and in reasonably good circumstances, making contributions to support local action. This is where we've been for the last 30 years, and I suspect that that's where we're going to be for the next 20 years or so. So let me then finish up with just 5 minutes on these big structural things that Ahmet dealt with at the beginning. So, first question: the universality of the body of international human rights law. I'm more than happy to talk on the theoretical kinds of issues. This is something that literally I've worked on since I was a graduate student, all right? But what I'm interested in is the universality of the body of human rights law. I'm relatively optimistic about that. I think that one of the things that we've discovered about China is that they have relatively narrow material interests that they prioritize, and they are not interested in disrupting things that are not deeply important to them.
At least.
Right? They're not going to push international human rights, but they are not going to try to disrupt international human rights action. At the UN, right, they participate. You know, they do the minimum to do their reports. They show up to the meetings. They don't denounce the body of law. All right, they're not going to push international human rights law. All right, but they're not going to actively get in the way, except in the way that any great power will do that, which is namely protecting their clients from charges of abuse. In the same way that the United States has done that, that the Russians do that, that every great power regularly does that. All right, they will make exceptions for their friends, just like Americans have always made exceptions for their friends, right? Where is human rights worse, Saudi Arabia or Iran? No question, it's far worse in Saudi Arabia, but we push human rights in Iran, and we think that absolute monarchies are absolutely wonderful, and we hold hands with dictatorial kings when we go and visit them, right? In other words, there's the everyday power politics that we expect in particular cases, but there's no evidence that the Chinese are likely to challenge the system of norms that are well established. In other words, the spaces continue to be there. The Chinese are not going to stop doing any supporting of human rights that they've done. They're not going to disrupt what's done at the UN level. And they're not going to get in the way of the United States and Europe and lesser powers, you know, like South Africa, trying to do things on behalf of human rights. In other words, precisely because the global human rights regime is largely normative, well established, and something that great powers can ignore in particular cases where it's important to them. They can protect their friends, right? It seems to me we're likely to have roughly the same kind of human rights politics that we've been having for the last 30 years, all right? There are countries where things are going better. There are countries where things are going worse, but there's no reason why we should expect a multipolar world to be worse than a bipolar world when it comes to human rights. And the rise of China in particular, given that the global human rights regime is not in any way threatening to China's perceived vital national interests, suggests that the spaces that have been available are likely to continue to remain available, and that is what we're likely to see evolving over time. Now, I think actually the more serious threat is what would happen as a result of a rise in geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China, or China and the rest of the world. In other words, if more and more of our attention becomes focused on an increasingly intense geopolitical rivalry with China, less and less of our attention and resources are available to be used on behalf of human rights. In other words, I don't think it's structure that matters so much. I think it's the question of how multipolar rivalry is carried out. The kind of multipolar rivalry that's being carried out now, in which it's basically fighting over small changes in shares, ensuring that China gets the recognition and the status that it insists rightly that it's entitled to. All right, that so long as we don't get to the point at which we start thinking about the actual possibility of military conflict with China, the space is unlikely to close down. All right? So in other words, if we're thinking about how multipolar rivalry develops, to the extent that people like Mearsheimer and Walt are correct, that war with China is inevitable, as we move towards that, there's less space for human rights and everything else. To the extent that globalization proceeds as it has, human rights is probably in relatively good shape. To the extent that rivalry with China is pursued through institutional embedding, human rights might actually come out better in the long run. The more international institutions China is more deeply embedded in, all right, the better off we are. So I think that what we need to do is recognize the distinctive character of the global human rights regime. We need to recognize the fact that multipolar rivalry can work out bad or pretty good for human rights, depending on how things go, and that is where we are now. That the big changes around us have not yet led to any changes in global politics of human rights, and they may not, and that there are at least real possibilities for action continuing. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to let you tell me how we deal with questions.
Right, thank you. Melissa, your voice, your microphone, I don't know, I can't hear you, I get to say. reminder from our technical staff that can you try, or you can read the question, Melissa, on the screen.
Is there a correlation between human rights and financial welfare? Even though Chinese GDP is steadily growing, we see more human rights violations on their part. Is this the interpretation of a wholly vested attack from another part of the world?
Okay. Everybody got the question? It's also available in the chat, so you can, I think, see it there. All right. So, I don't think that there's anything the least bit Western about the idea that people want to be able to control the conditions of their life. That they don't want to be dependent upon distant, uninterested powers controlling how they live their life. All right? I know of no evidence that suggests that, and lots of evidence suggesting otherwise. Now, what I think your question gets at is this interesting question of political trade-offs. If you're very poor and a government can get you out of poverty, you're likely to be pretty darn happy about that and say, this is, for me, now the most important thing. But your kids, who have not experienced poverty, or their kids who have not experienced poverty, are going to want more from life. And they're going to want not just to be kept alive, but to live a life worth living. And a life worth living requires some fundamental autonomy for yourself, for your family, and for the various communities that you are part of. Right? The idea behind human rights is that within certain broad limits, people are entitled to make for themselves the life that they want to make for themselves. And you can buy people off with increasing levels of per capita GDP for a reasonably long period of time. I suspect about 30 years. 40 years at most, 2 generations. All right, this is what we saw in Taiwan. This is what we saw in South Korea. I think this is what we're seeing in China. All right, that you can't take people who are living materially decent lives and tell them that they are not allowed to try to control the conditions of their life. Now, exactly what that means and what it looks like will be different in different places. All right, but certainly even in China, there are some localities where there is something that looks not unlike relatively free and open politics on a limited range of issues. Housing, environment being the two most sensitive ones, but there's possibilities for action there. All right, controlling corruption is becoming a huge problem in China. All right, in a certain sense, poor people are more likely to be tolerant of corruption than middle-class people. We know that in various ways. China, it seems to me, is running up against the limits of buying people off. And they are beginning to make steps towards some kind of opening that almost certainly has to come. Now, it's going to come in a Chinese way, all right? in the same way that in Korea it came in a Korean way, that in Singapore it came in a Singaporean way. But the idea that in the long run, people are happy with other people running their lives, even if they run their lives well, right, is not something that it seems to me we have any evidence to support. And as China shows, that once you get to the second or the third generation of people who are running other people's lives, they tend to run other people's lives much less well. You're seeing the same thing in Iran. I don't know if I should say anything about a country where several of you are sitting. All right? But notice that this is a short-term strategy for buying people off. That in the short term sometimes works very well and brings people up, which is a very, very good thing. But in the long run, it's not what anybody wants.
Thank you. Somewhere in one of your lectures available at YouTube, I watched it, that you say when you were studying human rights in early 1980s, you said that at that time you refer it as a frightening time. Now we are in a time that we have lived the atmosphere of the post 9/11 world. After that, we got the global financial crisis, and now we have a COVID-19 crisis that we don't know how long it will last. And those examples, will somehow bringing some of the powers of the states that they shared with the civil society. Can I ask you how frightening this time or the coming years, this time, our upcoming years would be?
All right, so let me try this kind of an answer. The only thing more frightening than a world of states, from the point of view of human rights, is a world without states. Because we have structured the implementation of human rights around state provision. So, to the extent that states are weakened, and no alternative system of provision develops, human rights are going to be in a bad situation. Right? Now, I don't see that happening too much now. Right? States have not gotten weaker. Other actors have gotten stronger. And more is being done in a variety of areas. So that it seems to me that for all the problems we've had over the last 20 or 30 years, states have continued to do, for the most part, I don't know that I want to say reasonably good jobs, but they have done at least as good as they were doing 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. All right, so you look at the Americas, you look at Europe, you look at Africa, right? Most African states are no less capable than they were 40 years ago, and many of them are substantially more capable. You look at ASEAN. You certainly look at East and Northeast Asia, right? That, there are places where you have completely incompetent states, Pakistan, Afghanistan, right? You pick your choice, right? But for the most part, we still have a world in which the majority of states that want to try to do a reasonably good job on human rights are positioned so that they can continue to do that. they are still able to tax resources in order to support massive social welfare states. If anything, it seems in recent years, Western countries are moving towards a system in which they are at least seriously thinking about trying to crack down on certain kinds of tax avoidance, largely because they know they need those resources to continue to support their welfare states. I mean, even the United States vaguely understands that, but certainly the Europeans understand that they need to be able to continue to tax multinational, global financial and economic flows, and we're moving to do that. All right? We have not developed alternative mechanisms of provision, and that's scary. All right? But so far, states are seemingly able to do as good a job as they were able to do 40 years ago in those circumstances where they actually want to be able to do it. All right, so I don't think that I'm likely to live to see a crisis, but as you say, maybe my son, he's only 10, so he's got a long way to go. You know, it is going to be differently positioned, and it's going to be, as you say, connected with the demise of the state, but the failure of any alternative mechanism for providing particularly economic and social rights. And going back to the first question, if performance on economic and social rights starts to spiral down, right, politics is going to become much more nasty and rights respective.
All right.
Don't be timid.
No. I have a question, but maybe it's I want to leave it as the last question from a friend of a student of mine. Asked that question. Let me ask it before going into another question or detail. She's asking that what would your advice be for the students now at IR studies or IR departments as an undergraduate or graduate students, in terms of studying or having an interest in human rights studies? What is the best to start? Which is the best, or what would you say?
I'm going to not answer that in a way that I think is appropriate. And I'm going to say that...
Can I say that it really depends on where they live?
It depends on where they live. It depends on what they're interested in. All right? Here's the great thing about human rights. Pretty much anything that you're interested in has a human rights dimension. Right? Anything that you think is worth doing has a human rights dimension. So I think you need to ask yourself what seems interesting and worth doing. Because if you're going to work on it, if you're going to invest a large part of your time, right, it should be interesting to you and worth doing. All right, since you're thinking about human rights, I am assuming that your first goal is not to become wealthy. Right, so having decided that you're not going to try to become wealthy, you ought to have fun with it, and it ought to be worth doing. So I would say, find out what it is that motivates you to want to work on something. And it may be just something accidental. You run across a person. You read a story in the newspaper. All right, you stumble on something that captures you, and you realize that this could profitably occupy you for an extended period of time. All right, it's like somebody says, what theory should I work on? All right, and my response is the theory that's useful for the thing in the world that you're working on. All right, find something worth doing, find something that motivates you, that will lead you to be able to do and sustain good work. And that is what we've got to do, you know? I mean, I stumbled on human rights. I mean, literally. 1976, I'm looking for a dissertation topic. Jimmy Carter's running for president. I do political theory and international relations. Oh, human rights. All right, 45 years later, in other words, it's what's important is finding for you how you can do something that seems worth doing and is going to motivate you and sustain you as you do work. And I say that to any student studying anything. Find out what you want to do and then commit to doing it. And the rest of it kind of takes care of itself. Or at least it's fairly easy to figure out how to do it. I mean, the hard thing is making that commitment to devoting some significant chunk of your time and effort and the limited resources that you have to doing something in particular. So, in my case then, so I did a lot of human rights theory. Is that because human rights theory is most important? No, it just happened to be something that I'm good at and that I found interesting and that was useful at the time. All right. And other people did other things that they were good at, that they found interesting and was useful at the time. And it all sort of ultimately fits together, or at least we hope it does.
Thank you. I will type to her that to go to KSIS and to take your courses there. It will broaden her, horizon on the topic.
We have actually one of our absolute best PhD student now is a Turk. I forget where he went. I think he's originally from Istanbul, but by far our best PhD student at the moment is Turkish. He's getting ready to go on the job market, and we're expecting really good things from him.
All right. I think, Melissa, you have a question, but can I just continue from this point that do you think that someone now in the world can go to a Chinese university or a Russian university to study human rights? And how difficult would it be? I have the answer from your.
I would say that it would be more difficult in a Russian university than a Chinese university, because but if you do it in a Chinese university, what you're going to likely get is a kind of narrow legalistic kind of approach. What is relatively safe to teach almost anywhere is international human rights law. So in Iran, Ambassador Zarif, when he got removed from his UN ambassador job, he went back to teaching at Tehran University, and he taught international human rights law. All right, I got an email from, I've known Javad for a long time. I got an email from him, and he said, they've decided I'm going to teach again. Can you share me your syllabus? All right, now that he's been removed, when he gets removed as foreign minister, he's going to go back and teach, and he's going to teach international human rights law. And I think that that's one of the things that's sort of striking. The body of law is relatively non-controversial. You can do it in China, right? You can do development studies in China that would link into human rights issues. You'd have to be kind of careful in terms of how you framed things. So I've had Saudi students, for example, who have been actually able to do some fairly interesting stuff. They just have to be careful about how they frame it, especially in the Arabic version of what they're writing. So, I had one student who had the English version of his dissertation, and he had a slightly different Arabic version of his dissertation. It was 90% the same. And he just filed the Arabic version of the dissertation with the sponsoring board for it. In other words, and I think that this is actually, it goes back to the sort of big theme that we've been talking about, the embedding of the global human rights regime. right? There are very few places where you couldn't do it at all right? What's going to be problematic is the constraints and how far beyond the narrow international law version of the story you can go, and exactly what the boundary lines are in terms of issues that you can't touch. Right? So I suspect that were you to go to China and want to study human rights, and we're interested in studying human rights violations in Turkey or the United States or the Czech Republic, you probably would be okay. You probably, however, don't want to study human rights in China. So, right? And I think that this is a broad sort of point, right? There's this global structure, but it's all really ultimately local. As you said, it depends on where you are. What you can do depends on the spaces where you are. But there are very few places that are like North Korea where there's no spaces at all. All right? And then the question becomes are the spaces that are available here ones where you are capable of effectively doing what it is that you want to do? So yeah, China, maybe. You want to go to Singapore? No problem. I've taught human rights in Singapore, no problem at all. And Singapore has lots of scholarships. All right. It's a not very open one-party regime, but it's okay. I personally love Singapore. I seriously considered moving to Singapore, which is not something a human rights person ought to say. But a place like Singapore, pretty free on what you want to do, although you're probably not going to deal with Singaporean politics, all right? Because there are minefields there. There are limits, but everybody knows what those limits are and how to operate within them. They call them out-of-bounds markers in Singapore. Everybody knows where the OB markers are in Singapore for Singaporean politics, but for anything else, you're fine. You can even, if you want to do human rights violations in Malaysia, they'll probably fund you, right? In other words, it's finding those spaces that work for you and recognizing that in most places there are at least some kinds of spaces that are available.
And let me remind our viewers that the syllabi of your courses are available at your website, personal website.
Yes, I have a lot of stuff that you probably don't want to read up there.
All right, Melissa, you have a question, I think.
Yes, I have one question. We talked about China's challenge on this issue, and we know that separate treaties, especially on racial discrimination, torture, or gender inequality, etc., have on average 88% of ratification rates. So reversely, the concept of overlapping consensus universality. What can be done to resolve disagreement between people from different backgrounds so that human rights can gain greater influence worldwide, especially for countries that do not accept the treaties for some reason, or countries that stay abstained? This was my question.
Okay. There's two kinds of ratification. Right now, most of the countries, all of the countries that really want to ratify have ratified. Coerced ratification may have certain kinds of value, but I don't think we should overestimate it. I think what's more problematic are deeply embedded cultural practices of superiority. I think the problem in China is that there is a widespread view that Han Chinese are better than non-Han citizens of China. And that the way to solve China's minority problems is to flood the country with Han immigrants. I don't think international human rights law has anything to do with that. And I don't think you're going to get at that through the body of international human rights law. I think that deeply embedded views of racial, ethnic, or cultural superiority are probably the most important impediment to implementing human rights in many places, and they are not the kinds of things that are subject to remedy within time frames of decades. All right. I think we have to wait for a younger generation of Chinese who have lived in a different world and have come to appreciate that difference is not necessarily negative. And I'm not going to talk about valuing diversity. I'm going to be more than happy with non-discrimination. All right. I said the first thing I look at is NGO registration. Second thing is laws on non-discrimination. All right. Once you get robust bodies of non-discrimination law, all right, things have begun to change. All right. China, in some areas, may be beginning to move in that direction. All right. Japan is moving in that direction with gender. All right. I think China may actually move faster than Japan for various demographic reasons over the next 20 years. But for example, I think the picture on gender discrimination in China over the next 20 years may be not so bad. All right. When it comes to ethnic discrimination, that's another matter. Right? So I think that what we want to do is to recognize that the legal framework sets certain broad kinds of parameters. And we know that there are certain areas, you picked issues of discrimination, all right, are absolutely central, because what that does is systematically exclude groups of people. And systematic exclusion of groups for group membership is completely corrosive of human rights. So that what we ultimately are aiming for is a system in which no groups are systematically excluded and every group is able to act autonomously in pursuit of its interests. All right. That's a very long run project, right? But that's largely what we have in the places with the best human rights records, right? And so focusing on real active non-discrimination and the real capacity for autonomous action on behalf of your own rights and interests, so that people they're not excluded and they are able to participate. All right, that's where we're going. And most countries are in a position where they can make some progress on some dimensions of some of those problems within a time frame of 5 or 10 years. Although some of those problems are really recalcitrant, like ethnicity in China.
Thank you. We have a final question, I would say, from a colleague from our department. Question is, there seems to be an opposition to human rights between globalization and internationalization. How are you looking at this?
Yeah, so I take it what you're getting at is the idea that because implementation systems are so national, all right, we're going to run up against problems of how you deliver, particularly economic and social rights, if in fact states are not capable of doing it. So on the one hand, the globalization of values is good for human rights. On the other hand, if states are no longer able to provide social security, provide health care, do the sorts of things that are necessary for actually implementing the full body of human rights, we've got a problem, right? And honestly, I don't know much what to say other than, as I said before, it does not seem to me that absolute state capacities have been degraded, right? I mean, in IR, we distinguish between absolute power and relative power, right? Because power is both absolute and relative. So the absolute capabilities of states remain robust. What's changing with globalization is the relative capabilities of states, all right? Where we would have a problem is if the absolute capabilities are degraded and there is no replacement international or global mechanism of delivering particularly social welfare rights. Right? Those are big structural things that I think it's really hard to figure out what's going on.
Thank you. A few minutes ago, you have mentioned about your son. Let me share a picture from one of your Corbett school lectures.
The infamous, yes, right. This is yeah. Yep, there he is. He was 1 year old, and I had the day wrong on when I was supposed to go give this talk for visiting students. And so I said, oh, hell, I'll just bring him. And so, yeah, he was pretty good that time. As you can see, as we got to the question period, he got a lot more active. But yes.
Yes. I shared this because we are lecturers and teachers around the world. We have experienced, unthinkable difficulties during the, the lockdowns and online teaching.
Yep.
And I remember that picture again. It is you are not only a researcher or professor on the topic, you're a practitioner as well. I found it from the human rights perspective. This was a very early and a very good example. And thank you for this. And I share it with my students and my colleagues here.
Yeah, I have thought of taking that down, and several people said, no, leave it up. It's great. And I get students, even now who say, wow, this is really cool. This is a nice place. This is the kind of place I want to come. So yes, great. And you guys are back in person now at school, yes?
Yeah, we are here.
Yeah. Yeah, we're back in person. It's so nice. We've learned that we can Zoom for things like this. And that's really good, but being back in person is so wonderful.
We are back to in-class teaching lectures, but we had this lecture, opening lecture for the academic year, but at the same time for opening or for launching of our new IR undergraduate program fully in English.
That's great.
Unfortunately, opening lecture again, we had it online.
But
hopefully, we will have you here in Istanbul.
It would be lovely.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything else? And I let you go because you are there. Maybe it's very early morning hours. You may have had.
No, it's not. We're up to 9:30. We're fine. I dropped my son off at school. We were running 5 minutes late today. So thank you very much. This has been fun. I hope it was useful for you. And you know, maybe next time we'll do this in Istanbul.
Okay, thank you. And I look forward to having it here in Istanbul.
Thank
at
you.
the department and have a Mediterranean breakfast by the Bosphorus.
Yes, definitely. Good bread and cheese.
Melissa, you can close the program. Thank you, Professor Donnelly.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right, let's leave.